Your time is valuable, so I will go ahead and get started. So, thankfully, I know everyone, which makes this really nice. But whenever you decide to go into history, you always do have in the back of your head this, am I making a pact with the devil? Like, I love this subject, but I don't want to be poor. And so that's what this is actually designed to combat. But before then, Chloe, you were going to talk a little bit about the History Club. Do you want to get up and talk? Or okay. So I'm going to get out of frame and let her take over, and then I shall be back.
So for those of you that don't know, RMU does have a history club here on campus, and we meet every other Friday in the Hale building between 5 and 6 p.m. So a little bit about the history club. So it's a social organization that is pertaining towards like historical interest, but you don't necessarily have to have an interest in history or be a history major to be a part of the club, as our vice president is a nursing major, and then our secretary is a biomedical engineering major. And then one of the big things the club does is we travel to a place of historical significance in a trip during the spring. The club was formed in 2007 here on campus, and we have many events and activities throughout the year. So some of our past activities the club has done is we typically do movie nights. At our last meeting, we watched the documentary of During the Ocean, World War II. And then I think we're trying to plan a Halloween movie night. And then we take a day trip to Pittsburgh. It's typically led by our club advisor, Dr. Barr, and he does a walking tour throughout the town. And we visit sites of historical significance, such as the remnants of Fort Pitt and Fort Duquesne, and then we typically get lunch. Our tentative date for this is in November. It'll be a Saturday afternoon or early morning. And then we do community service activities, as well as we've tailgated at homecoming before. And then we take like a big multi-day trip in the spring. So here's the list of locations the club's previously visited.
Keep that up there for a second. I just need to point this out. Most spring breaks, people are going to places like Fort Lauderdale and Daytona.
Gettysburg. I love it.
It's come on. I mean, we are all unabashed nerds here. Let's embrace this. All right, I'm sorry. Go on.
Our top 3 locations for this year are Charleston, I think is the number 1, Roanoke, as well as Jamestown/Williamsburg. And then our next club meeting is going to be Friday, October 14th from 5 to 6 p.m. in Hale, and we'll be hosting a History Jeopardy featuring those 5 topics. And then we will also be discussing the day trip and gauging club members' interest in how many we would be looking at to go.
You know, I would be happy to send out a big email blast for you about that upcoming meeting.
Yeah.
So if somebody just wants to send me, like, if there's a flyer you've created or just information about the meeting and what you're going to be doing at the meeting, if you email it to me, I'll send it out to, I can do like all the undergrads, or I could just do SIHSS, or I could just do all the history majors and all the history minors, whoever you want. So,
Okay,
you know,
yeah.
please feel free to let me help promote your group.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And then this is like our club's contacts. The starred people would be the most important to contact, such as our president, Zach, and then our secretary, Victoria, who tracks attendance, as the people eligible to go on the trip are tracked via like a point system. So the more meetings you attend, the more points you earn, the more activities you attend, the more points you earn. And then...
Oh, poor Jimmy. Nicely done. All right, thank you. Before I get in, and by the way, regardless, look, joining the History Club may not necessarily help your earnings potential, but it will absolutely help your fun potential. And you know, man does not live by bread alone, so I would recommend that. One thing before I really jump into this, only because our presenter is limited on time. Megan here had just completed her practicum at Soldiers and Sailors. If you would mind talking to us about it, tell us what you thought of it and what you learned.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you want me to go up?
If you would like to, well, we're being recorded, so.
Okay, yeah.
So.
Okay. Yeah, so like Dr. Fanning said, I did my internship at Soldiers and Sailors, which is a military museum in Oakland. I had a really great time. I gained a lot of really good hands-on experience. The biggest thing I did all summer was I learned how to catalog and archive. And the system that they use is Past Perfect museum software, which a lot of museums use, a lot of libraries use. So I obviously gained a really valuable skill there. because it's one of the easier softwares to use, so it's sort of a transferable skill as well. And one of the coolest things that I did over the summer at my internship was they kind of just gave me free reign to go up to the archives. And obviously, as long as I was working, as long as I was cataloging, I could pretty much look at anything I wanted. And they have some really, really, really cool stuff, really cool stuff there.
Favorite item?
Oh, that's so hard.
One of your favorite items.
Okay, one of my favorite items. They have a flag from a town that was liberated in France during World War II. It was a Nazi flag. They took the flag, and all of the soldiers signed the flag, saying hey, we liberated this town. And I thought that was really cool. I'm not a World War II buff, but some of the stuff they have on collection is really neat. Another really cool thing is I worked with a lot of uniforms, and I worked with a lot of really unique uniforms because they only take in so many uniforms now because they have so many. And then they also hold a summer camp, and so over the course of the week of the summer camp, I was herding kids and I was doing kind of babysitting basically, but the whole time we were teaching them about history and historical events. We had reenactors, so it was really cool. And if you still need to do an internship, absolutely apply. I know they don't have an intern this semester at all, so you could probably reach out to them and be hey, I need an internship, and Lisa has you. She's got you. So
Megan, how did you find out about the internship? Did you find it online, or did you just know or hear about it?
So Dr. Fanning recommended it to me. And then Dr. Ruzick also mentioned it because I think one of her daughters did their internship there, and she did research for her anthology there. So, yeah.
Thank you. Appreciate it. And to be honest, the big advantage of the reason we make you do the practicum is so that when you graduate, your resume isn't blank. And this makes a difference because the number one paradox you run into upon graduation is most jobs want experience, which you don't have because you can't get a job, because you don't have experience, because you don't have a job, because you don't, et cetera, et cetera. That actually helps break the logjam. We've also placed people, Heinz, of course, is the big famous one, the Heinz History Center, but there's also Carnegie Museum. Museum work is a great way to get your foot in the door. The other thing I would recommend, local historical societies. There's one in Coriopolis. Every little town has one. It's usually staffed by one retiree who gets no pay, and they desperately do need the help.
They need so much help.
All right.
So much.
Thank you so much, Megan. I appreciate it. So the big question, of course, here is, now in the abstract, you all know why history majors. You're history majors. You know why history matters. The question is, what can I do with it? Specifically, will I be eating cold ramen for the rest of my life? No. Now, while this is not a get-rich-quick field, it is get comfortable slow. And to that point, the most common fields we find our history majors landing into, and this is in no particular order. I simply put it in the most obvious to the ones that would surprise you. So, obviously, teaching, hello, and research. No, go back. Teaching and research are the two big ones. Libraries and archival work, you just heard Megan. It's more than just pieces of, you will be handling artifacts, you will be handling electronic databases, all of which have transferable skills. I don't know about you, but the idea of being let loose in an archive unsupervised for 4 hours fills me with glee and anticipation. So there is that. The legal field. You would be shocked how many of our majors go on toward law school. So I saw something today just made me chuckle. It was, lawyers are basically just attack librarians. And there's some truth to that. And so law is a natural byproduct. Journalism, we get a lot of history majors that enjoy writing, especially the investigative report. Remember, as historians, we are sort of detectives. Journalism naturally fits that. This is the one that most people don't realize, tourism, tour guides. there is a large call for that, and you are a more effective tour guide because you're marrying not only the teaching field, the public speaking part, with the historical knowledge. So it's more than just, do I want to teach high school or college? There's a whole realm of possibilities. I like to sort of joke about this when they say, what can I do with a history degree? A good answer is anything you really want to. I mean, it's a pretty versatile degree. Almost the Swiss Army knife of degrees. What helps you get a job is emphasizing the skills you get. And this is where all the social sciences excel, but history in particular is quite good at. There are 4 main skills we teach you as part of the program, and since none of you are freshmen, you all know this. The first one, obviously, conducting research. Conducting your research, identifying the key issues, identifying key questions. That can sometimes be incredibly challenging because, hey, look, you may love the Eastern Roman Empire, that's great. What do you want to focus on? Its coolness? I mean, you have to come up with a niche, but also gathering resources. This is difficult under any circumstances, and every major public or private firm does research, and they need people who know how to do this. Thing number 2, you think you're going to be marketable? Throw that in there, analyzing data, which is not just taking the information and organizing it. It's also about context, and that's really what we as historians do. We look at this immense amount of data left over from societies that aren't here anymore, and then we have to provide the context for understanding what the significance is. Number 3, managing resources. All of you have had, or will have, because many of you are in a class of mine, a paper due. You think you're not going to have to manage resources and timelines? That's our bread and butter. It's what we do. To a degree, we also want you to add in personnel, making sure people have the right tasks for the right skill set. And then finally, interacting with the public. Ta-da. This is part of the teaching process. You have to know how to interact with people, present dense information in a way that doesn't overwhelm your audience. And hopefully I've got at least a C+ in that. So at the end of the semester, you'll fill out your evaluations and I'll find out. But that is an important aspect, is the ability to interact with the public. So these 4 I put up here routinely rank in the top 5 of skills that employers want their employees to have. So in that sense, it's a very marketable degree, despite the somewhat old-fashioned name. So what sets us apart? Why is history not data analytics or something along those lines? The simple fact is what we have to specialize in, because all of our subjects are dead, is providing context and connection. Context is in why are these factors important, but also connection. How does culture impact economics, impact politics, impact military, impact environmental concerns? And in many ways, what we're finding out in the information age is that no agency, no company can act in a vacuum. You may have a company that specializes in making refrigerators. I'm looking at you, Frigidaire. But they're going to need parts that come from other countries because the minerals needed for those parts are in other countries. And they're going to have to know, all right, well, yes, I know that Japan is stable, but we get the copper from Chile. Are we going to have to worry about our supply? Make sense? So that is the sort of thing we provide as historians. And that's the sort of thing, that's like the extra element, the special sauce you can bring to an employer that's, no disrespect, College of Business, but I am kind of calling you out on this, that other majors can't. Okay? So there's essentially 2 major categories of potential careers in history: private sector, public sector. So I'm going to deal with the private sector first. This is the one that most parents, by the way, I'm sure all of your parents, when you said, I'm going to be a history major, went, Really? You sure about that? Precisely for the, can you get a job? The answer is absolutely. Every single corporation needs one of two things that you are eminently qualified to do when you graduate. Manage projects, because let's be honest, managing a project for Frigidaire for the rollout of a new product is not that different from a semester thesis. It really isn't. And finally, records and information managers. Every major corporation keeps records. They need someone to manage and archive information, because they will always have to, whether it's sales figures, whether it's new branches opening in other areas, they need us. Other career paths in the private sector, and if I'm going too quickly, tell me to slow down, but I want to go through these one by one. Journalism, we sort of already talked about this. There is an enormous amount of cross-pollination between journalism and the social sciences and vice versa. It's just, as historians, we're not used to interrogating live people. But there's still an enormous amount of investigative work that is done in the journalistic field that we do every single day when we're going through historical artifacts and documents. And in many ways, it's still that same, you're trying to piece together, all right, what is the real story here? Now, in terms of salary, this can be all over the place. Right now the internet is rewriting the rules on journalism, and a lot of journalistic institutions are finding that out. For example, Newsweek, and I think Time, I might be wrong, these were mainstays of American media. They've recently gone all digital now. How you write stories, how you bring graphs and other infographics are going to matter. Tourism, I mentioned tour guides. They are needed everywhere. Now, I am going to mention something in the public sector that does fall into this, so just to put a pin in that. But we're not even talking, tour guides of, Fort Pitt. This can be abroad. I mean, people like traveling. More people are traveling than ever before. There is a need there. Genealogist. Anyone ever watch one of those, Who Do You Think You Are, or Finding Your Roots? The older you get, the more appealing those are, especially once you start having children. And it becomes quite important. More people are doing this than ever before, in part because DNA testing makes it so much easier. But if you're a historian, you have a huge leg up because you already know how to navigate this system. And people will pay for this. And finally, general writing. You can't be a historian without knowing how to write well. That opens up a whole bunch of potential career paths. Make sense? Any questions on the private sector? We actually place a surprising number of graduates. I would argue, now I'm spitballing this, so not exact figures. I would say about 1 out of 4 of our graduates go on to successful careers in the private sector. Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So how about museums, jobs in museums?
I'm getting to that. Thank you. No, you're absolutely right, but that falls under the public sector.
Okay.
But absolutely. Museums are huge. So we'll start here. Museums, archives, libraries. Not all the same thing, but all closely related. They're sort of the fraternal triplets of public history. Public history has become a huge field, mainly because you're straddling the line between pure research and public service. And there are enormous numbers of museums, some big, some small. It's everything from the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. to the Hancock County Historical Society. But there are people who do use it, and it is a public service. Absolutely. So I'll start with the unexpected one. Remember I mentioned tourism? The United States National Park Service, the rock star of our land conservation services. You need park rangers and tour guides. And by the way, things that are parks, Gettysburg, battlefields are one, Bunker Hill, but also the Old North Church in Boston, Independence Hall. One of the colleagues I actually did my doctoral work with is the assistant director of the Eisenhower Presidential Library and Museum.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah. So there, and it's all over the country that where you can work on this. If you specialize in non-American history, if you've got the travel bug, this could be a good field. Other things, obviously, education. Now, I'm going to start with this because I'm very biased. I was a high school history teacher for 13 years before I became a college professor. So I'm biased. I love it. But I will say it's not for everyone, but I would argue it is an incredibly rewarding career. If your goal is to try to make the world better slowly, then it can be incredibly rewarding. I look forward to getting up to work in the morning. I intend to, I mean, no offense, Dr. Ali, but if you're going to get me out of here when they wheel me out on a gurney, that's the way that's going to work out. I'm here for good. But and by the way, education is also public and private. Multiple levels, secondary, collegiate. So there's a lot of possibility there. By the way, one that straddles this, our U.S. military academies have a very robust history program for obvious reasons. A lot of our government agencies do have special training, and historians are necessary. Which brings us to the State Department, diplomacy. If you want to combine public service with an intense knowledge of world events and how countries interact and all those different factors, State Department is a wonderful career.
And to put in a plug,
yes.
Tuesday, the Center for Global Engagement will be here in Wheatley talking about jobs overseas. So again, tying right into that.
And one of the nice, no, I'm sorry, did you have more? I'm sorry.
No, that was it.
Okay. And by the way, to give you a little extra incentive, and you may think, wait a minute, aren't just the ambassadors big donors? Well, yeah, for the glamour positions. Ambassador to Britain, or my personal favorite, ambassador to Vatican City. What on earth do you talk about? I have no idea, but okay. Yeah, those are considered pretty plum jobs. Most rank and file careerists will not go to those. But you know what you will go to? There's a whole bunch of countries in non-white parts of the world that are critically important but aren't considered glamorous. Those get filled by policy experts. How do you get a policy expert? You work your way up, and a history degree is a fantastic first step in. And if I can get certified to translate Russian, the language will not be an issue for you, I promise you. And they will give you training in that as well. The other benefit is public service careers do tend to come with a certain amount of job security, particularly in State Department or in defense. The Defense Department is more than just bullets and bombs. I mean, these are policy experts. They have their own data collecting services. They need analysts. What is a historian if not an analyst? Make sense? So all of these are good public sector possibilities. Which of course brings us to the proverbial $48,000 question. Is there anything else? There is one, the nonprofit area. Now, nonprofits aren't run by the state, but they're not corporations. They're not designed to create a profit. And they tend to fall into two major categories. Category one, community development and advocacy. Okay, the so-called community organizers. The other category, public issue advocacy, that aren't limited to one community, but address things like domestic violence, systemic racism, access to health care, clean water, that sort of thing. What are some examples of these? Doctors Without Borders is an international one, along with UNICEF. The Urban League of the United States is one that focuses on improving urban decay in most American cities. The United Way is a sort of a catch-all charity, and then of course the American Heart Association. We had one of our sociologists actually retire from RMU and then take a job at the AHA. So there is an enormous amount of cross-pollination there. All these nonprofits are geared toward achieving a better result for the community somewhere down the road. Make sense? Now, if you're looking at community development, I mean, Pittsburgh, like every other American city, is chock-a-block with all sorts of community organizations, urban renewal leagues, things like that. And your skills will be in demand. Which brings us to the cash. What can you expect? Okay, so a few caveats about this list. Number one, this is as of 2021. Seeing as it is no longer 2021, I would like to point out your mileage may vary. The other thing is these are averages, so beware of averages. Because on average, Jeff Bezos and I both make $110 million a year, so it's all him. So, but on average, tour and travel guides make 32.2. That is below the median, but the one benefit of that career, it's good for people just starting out, fresh out of college, y'all. And in particular, most of these guys do offer ancillary benefits like some sort of housing and living stipend. Legal secretaries, to give you an idea, if we're starting here, remember I mentioned law back on slide 1? The legal career does pay well. Getting more direct. Now, you may say museums, oh, that's only 45. This is starting out. And by technician, that can mean anything from cataloging and archiving, like Megan talked about. What's a conservator?
Isn't that somebody who's preserving stuff?
Precisely.
Artifacts and stuff?
You know, they bring in an artifact that is in, how shall I put it, rough shape. They basically give it to you, save this. And they will train you how to do that. But every museum needs conservators for obvious reasons. I mean, even medals don't last indefinitely. Curators tend to make quite a bit more. Again, these are averages. So we are averaging the director of the Smithsonian Institution with the acting director of the Hancock County Historical Society. So beware averages. High school teachers. I used to be this. Contrary to popular belief, it is not abject poverty. But again, mileage may vary. It depends on where you work. If you work for sort of a mainline school district in a big-ish town or a part of a city, this is reasonable. If you're working for a Catholic school in inner city, it's going to be significantly less. If you're teaching at a private college prep academy that is highly selective and not paid for by the state, it will be much higher. But this will give you an idea. Archaeologists, which I sometimes like to joke are historians that like being outdoors a lot. Pretty comparable. And there's always a need for archaeology. Of course, what's the difference between archaeology and history?
Like history is based off like written record, like words, but archaeology is based off like what people left behind.
Precisely. Less books, more pottery fragments. But then again, on the plus side, you could pretend you're Indiana Jones. So there's that. Writers and authors actually make a significant amount of money. Again, this is one of those things where the average coverage, that word average is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that. If you're working as a part-time tech writer, it's not going to be this high. But if you're the next Stephen King, it could be much greater. You get the idea. Anyone want to take a guess what a historical consultant is?
Someone who works with film producers and things like that when they're making media, they'll consult a historian to make sure they're getting some accuracy.
Not that they always listen to us.
No.
Mel Gibson. But it's also not just feature films, it's documentaries. And if you've noticed, there's been an explosion in documentary channels. Not just the ones that are broadcast on cable. Some of them are just YouTube channels, and they still rake in considerable amounts of money. So that could be a good thing. Chief Academic Officer, I wonder if we have any of those here.
In the future.
In the future, there you go. It depends on where you are. Again, now these tend to be things like principals, superintendents, or college provosts and presidents, but again, it varies. Obviously, the president of Ohio State University is going to be making a little bit more money than the principal at Montour. But again, you can get an idea. And finally, here's the surprising one. Remember when I mentioned private sector and information manager, and everyone was like, well, I haven't heard of that. By the way, this range is really narrow. You can be pretty well assured that you'll be making a significant salary there, just due to your own training in managing and cataloging information and keeping it available. Okay? So what are the big earners, the most obvious ones? Public sector blows away the private sector. Sorry to bust a myth there, but in general, and tend to be more openings. That's why most of our graduates do tend to go on to more public sector work, whether it's education or State Department, Defense Department, or museums. But in general, again, beware the word average, but on average, the salaries tend to be higher. That is followed by private sector, particularly. Now, you may say, I don't do research and development. I meant the firm that hires you does research and development, not you personally. You will not be holding the pipettes. You will be working with documents, consultants, and then finally universities over here. That is the rough overview. I'm sure there are a couple of questions, even if they're purely hypothetical. And by the way, if you want to embarrass me, my boss is watching. So by all means. Any questions at all? Yeah, Aiden.
If you don't mind me asking, whenever you said you were a history teacher at
Yes.
high school for 13 years, did you have your doctorate before then, during then, or
After.
after? So yeah, what was your whole process with that, like out of school and then until now?
Okay, Fanning's life story. I graduated with my bachelor's degree in 1995, and the degree was in, I had no idea what I was going to do. I was rudderless. I'm glad there's no social media, because as far as you know, I was never in my 20s, but I had no idea what I was going to do. I knew I was good at history. Over the summer, I got an opportunity to teach English abroad, and I fell in love with teaching. This is amazing. This is so much fun. Even if I don't know what I'm doing, effort apparently counts. So I came back and I went and I got my master's in education. And then from there, my first job was I was teaching at an all-girls Catholic school in the south side of Chicago, which was incredibly rewarding. The pay was minimal. I sort of joke that was the closest I've ever been to being homeless. That's back when your coffee table is. Your end table is basically a milk crate that's turned upside down. That's what that is. But it also showed me how powerful this could be, because to this day on social media, I'm still in contact with 5 different members of the first class of students I taught in the 98-99 school year. They have kids now, which is weird, because that makes me a grand teacher. From there, I moved to Ohio so I could marry the love of my life and eventually have Emily. So I taught in Toledo, Ohio for 10 years. And I didn't leave because of the students. The students were great. But this was back at the height of the bad old days of standardized testing.
And what were you teaching, Dr. Fanning?
I taught a number of subjects. I taught world history, U.S. history, civics, as well as economics. And by the way, if you do go into secondary education, you are going to have to be able to teach all 4 of those in one degree or another. Thankfully, they're all very closely related, so it's not that hard. But the moment the Ohio Department of Education, I hope they're watching, told me not to bother teaching how the First World War started because the kids wouldn't be tested on it, is the day I said, I can't do this. And I went home and I told my wife, who was equally shocked, and then I went, sweetheart, darling, you remember that PhD I always kicked around getting? How would you feel? And to her credit, she was the single most supportive human being. That was the year I decided I stopped. I was going to go back and get my doctorate. And I actually did finish in 4 years, in part because Susan threatened to lovingly murder me if I didn't get off my butt and finish on time. And as luck would have it, that summer after graduation is when RMU called me and offered me the position. And I have been here since 2010.
That was our lucky day.
Oh, thank you. It was very lucky for me, too. Although, fun fact, this is apropos of nothing, but it's a fun story. We had to move right after I graduated, because we had to get ready, because I didn't know where the heck I was going to be. The number that was on my CV that I sent to RMU was actually wrong. They couldn't get a hold of me for 2 weeks. They were about ready to give up when just by chance the backup number called. And so I was offered the job, but I was offered the job of the first week of August. So 3 weeks I had to quickly turn around, move everyone over. That I don't really, I think my brain blocked a lot of that out. I don't remember the process. But honestly, it was one of the best days of my life. I have no regrets at all. It worked out well. So it was an evolution, and my circumstances won't be yours because we're now not in this standardized testing craze. I'm sure at some point a new craze will come down the pike, but for now, it's just going to be a different situation. Does that help? Anything else?
What about any internships in archaeology? Do you know if there's any of those kind of in the area?
Internships in archaeology, in the area, not terribly. Now, in the country, quite possibly. There are certain, especially out west. Remember, out west, if any city wants to start expanding, a new zoning area, well, especially if you happen to be in places like Arizona, you got to do an archaeological survey first to make sure you're not on a Zuni or Hopi burial ground. And since there are, for obvious reasons, that's far more an issue. The other issue is out west, there's far more federal land than state land. And so as a result, everything has to be checked out first. So that is absolutely a possibility. The other thing to look at is international universities. Archaeology is one of the rare fields where it actually might be more advantageous to go to, say, the State University of Quito in Ecuador rather than, say, Ohio State University. Just because their sites tend to be, 2 blocks down and to the right. Yeah, yes.
Dr. Fanning, what kind of engaged learning opportunities would you encourage like freshmen and sophomores to be doing in order to prepare for that practicum their senior year?
The best bet I can come up with is going to sound a little boilerplate. The first one is get involved. I mean, History Club is a great example. Yeah, it's just students. It's very zero pressure, but you're around other people who are into history. You're around other people who share the same passions, and sometimes students develop their own projects. That would definitely be one. I think others volunteering over the summer, particularly at the school district you graduated from, being willing just to volunteer to get a taste of it is not a bad idea. The problem with a lot of internships is they generally require you to be an upperclassman before they'll take you. But not necessarily always. Another good volunteer prospect, any local library is automatically good training because they will have an organization system. They will have an archival system that you'll get to learn. The other thing, though, the number one thing, I can't push this enough, local historical societies are in desperate need. This is going to sound horrible. They're in desperate need of unpaid labor. Hello, unpaid labor. On the plus side, though, you can put it on a CV. It is work experience. It is skill experience. And it is directly relevant to what you're going to be going into.
Do our students get internships here in the local museums?
Yeah, and we sort of talked about that a little, but absolutely. Megan McMullen just finished at Soldiers and Sailors. Heinz has internships. And they're not as packed as you'd think. I think most, even the Carnegie Natural History and Art Museum, any museum is a good internship experience. Let's be clear. Even if it's the Andy Warhol, it's good. But there's a lot of art. Fort Pitt is always sort of a good source for internships. But even going further abroad, Old Economy Village is a good one, depending on how far you want to go. There are different living history museums in Ohio and West Virginia and Maryland, to say nothing of the Appalachians in Pennsylvania, that will offer those sorts of internships. Also, because everyone loves the Civil War, Civil War battlefields will offer internships, usually during the summer. That's really when they need people because they get inundated. And you do need a historian on a battlefield because otherwise, 9 times out of 10, it's a field. There are no armies, there are no cannons, there's a little plaque, and you have to use your imagination, which is why generally the public needs a guide to say, okay, this is why this hill with the weeds on it is important. Yeah, so.
One more question, since
Yes,
I
sir.
saw the salaries were so high for the record and information management.
Mhm.
So where are those jobs?
Those are typically private sector jobs. Almost any corporation in America has an archives division. They have to keep public records for no other reason, just for public accountability purposes. And yes, that does include the IRS. But also, when any executive comes up with another idea, the first question is, have we ever done that before? Check with records. And so it is basically, you're the archivist, the historian for that firm or that conglomerate. And by the way, it doesn't have to necessarily be private corporations. It can be the Greater Chicago Chamber of Commerce, for example, or, the local commodities board. Any sort of government institution especially has a records division. If you're thinking about law, the police department, the courts, hospitals, they all have enormous records, some of which are quite sensitive, and therefore you have to be trained in how to keep these records responsibly, which is followed by 99% of our presidents. So,
And
yeah,
we
I'm glad
hear
you
a
caught
lot
that.
Now, the National Archives would be another, I believe.
That is the crown. I didn't want to say that because that's the dream. That's, for historians, that's like the high school football player who wants to play for the Steelers. I mean, every now and then, yeah, you get a Kenny Pickett, but in general, there are positions, if you can land an internship at the National Archives and Records Administration, wow, it's perfection. And by the way, just so you know, one of your predecessors not long ago, she graduated 2 years ago, got an internship at the Air and Space Museum of the Smithsonian. You want to talk about the crown jewel. Got an internship and then got offered a position at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C.
So we have a great program called the Washington Center that we
Oh,
collaborate with,
absolutely.
where you can spend a whole semester in Washington, D.C., and you take a couple classes through them, but they help you find an internship in the D.C. area, right? So private, public, any of these things. So definitely think about that. If you're interested in doing, a semester away from campus, either a study abroad would be amazing, but also a semester in Washington, like Dr. Fanning said.
Absolutely.
You could maybe get an internship, at a Smithsonian or at the National Archives. That would be amazing for your career.
By the way,
Great point, yeah.
is everyone here aware that the Smithsonian isn't one museum, but a metric hecton of them? Yeah, and so bear in mind, it's not just one opportunity. You could wind up at the the Museum of the American Indian, or the National Gallery,
Or the Portrait Gallery.
the portrait gallery. Either way, it's a huge feather in your cap. Do not ask, you think I should take it? Yes, immediately do so, but it will do wonders. And if you decide you want to be a professional historian, i.e. an academic, like us, that is going to gain you admission to some of the big prestigious programs, like University of Michigan Ann Arbor, which is sort of the king daddy of the history programs right now in the United States.
I didn't know that. That's interesting.
Yeah, there's no one champion, but Michigan Ann Arbor is so often either at the top or number 2 that basically, we like to joke that they produce college championships and editors-in-chief of the American Historical Review, because half of them have come out of Michigan.
So that college is to history as MIT is to cyber?
Yeah, pretty much. What MIT is to the tech field, Michigan Ann Arbor is for the historical field. But there are other really good ones. I mean, you don't just focus on that. Although I will say, at the risk of cheesing off people from the northeastern United States, Yale and Harvard are overrated. Okay, there, I said it.
I have a
Back
good-
to- Yeah, go
Yeah,
ahead.
go ahead, Nick.
Oh, I was just gonna interject that I have a cousin that graduated from RMU and he works at Yale now.
Does he support my analysis?
Most likely.
Okay. All right, any others?
Dr. Ali was gonna say
Yeah,
something.
just want
Oh,
to
yes.
go back to that. So currently, you may want to reach out to Dr. Anthony Moretti about the Washington Center. So currently, he's seeking applications, and so Professor
Do it.
Fanning can connect you with him if you haven't heard from him. So that would be really great experience. I lived in Washington D.C. for years and years, so it's such a great experience. I think will be a really good
Yeah.
exposure. Especially those museums and are free too. So majority of those museums are free. You can just walk in, and would be really great exposure for you all.
So
Also, study abroad
oh, yeah.
would be just amazing. I mean, if you're
Oh,
interested in
yeah.
Russian history, go to Russia.
No, well, maybe not Russia right now, but in all seriousness, if you're interested in history that's not specifically U.S., study abroad is invaluable, and we have numerous opportunities. And you never know. I had no idea I was going to be studying national identity and specializing in Russo-American affairs when I was doing my undergrad. I was just trying to do college and not fail at it. So you never know. Life does take you on some interesting twists and turns. So.
And Europe has so many of good history places.
Oh, yeah.
Roman history and other.
You're in it.
Are we doing any flip for history?
Well, next semester I'm hopefully, knock on wood, doing the Rome study tour.
Okay, here you go.
Yeah. And yes, I can only imagine what study abroad in Rome would be like for an entire semester. That's got to be surreal.
Oh, that would be amazing.
Yeah, you take your classes and then, the Colosseum, cool. Anyway, Anyway, so that's a quick overview. Thank you for coming. If you have any further questions, do not hesitate to drop me an email or grab me after class. All right, thank you.